Welcome, everybody. Well, that got quiet fast. I hope you all had a great holiday weekend. Hope you had fun and did something new and relaxing. I had an opportunity to go to Pins over the weekend. Anybody here been to Pins Mechanical? Pretty fun place. I highly recommend if you want something different to do. Anyway, we are here today, Steve and I, to talk to you about another one of our top projects for the year called Analytics Services. So without further ado, why don't we jump into it?
All right.
So for a couple of years now, since Steve really came into this role back in 2015, we've been working on this vision for enterprise data at the university. How do we foster a culture of data-driven decisions and thought leadership through accurate, accessible, and innovative analytics? In other words, how do we make better decision makers? How do we enable them to make better decisions because the data that they need are right at their fingertips? So when we got started on this journey, Steve put together this enterprise data strategic direction. This was a one-pager meant to capture our thinking about how we would approach a new kind of modern data environment. And so this data strategic direction was organized into 3 buckets. And each one is represented as a column here. So the very leftmost column is the bucket of metrics, the idea of counts and calculations. Think of it like, how many students do we have? How many employees do we have? What's our current turnover rate for employees? Analytics Workbench, or this idea of mashup, is the column in the middle. That's the concept of taking data out of enterprise systems and combining them with data from other data sources, either within the university or beyond, for additional insights. And then on the right-hand side is this idea of mining. How do we take all of the data assets that we have available and explore them, looking for new patterns and new ways of making meaning about things? So if we fast forward to...
Hey, Diane, if I could add too,
Sure.
I think it's important to point out that all 3 of these metrics, mashup, and mining, all 3 are important to have a healthy organization, right? So they're not mutually exclusive. This isn't necessarily some continuum that we want to move through, but to ensure that we have good balance for all 3 of these.
Right. So the enterprise project, this little thing going on, Dave, thank goodness, is leading this effort with great courage. Enterprise project, the scope of it is focused fully on metrics and mashups. And this effort under Analytics Services takes us more to the right-hand side of that equation. All right, so the enterprise project, it's a great collaboration between what is happening under the enterprise project and what we're envisioning to accomplish under this Analytics Services initiative. So of course, the enterprise project, the current state, we have reporting available through PeopleSoft. Well, we know and love eReports, BuckIQ, the data warehouses and data marts that we have in place. SIS ODS is a longtime friend of many people across the university. And all of the spread marts, or local spreadsheets, we call them spread marts, that individuals have in their units that they use for their own analytics and decision making that are basically extractions from all these systems. So the future state that's going to be built as part of the enterprise project moves a lot of, the reporting that we have in PeopleSoft today, a good chunk of the reporting that we have in eReports and in BuckIQ today, a good chunk of that is going to be moving into Workday and will be expressed through Workday reports and analytics within the Workday reporting environment. But there will still be things that we can't do in Workday that we'll need to be able to get the data to our decision makers that they need for timely decision making. So to that end, we've envisioned a reporting and analytics environment. The plan is to put that in place in Amazon Web Services. That will include a Tableau Enterprise Server, which would be a visualization tool that we can use to prepare dashboards, scorecards, and other kinds of reports for folks to drill down into. And that's supported underneath by an enterprise data warehouse, a new enterprise data warehouse, and this concept of an enterprise data lake. Enterprise data lake being a place where we put a lot of unstructured data and give people query capabilities to go and explore those data to answer sort of what-if questions. So if we go back to the idea of turnover rate. Out of Workday reporting, we'll know how many employees we have, what's our current turnover rate. But if we want to know, well, why do we have a turnover rate of 40-some% in, let's say, junior faculty? Well, then that data lake gives us a way to start exploring data and looking for patterns so that we can say, maybe that's something to investigate further. Data virtualization is another capability that will be brought to this through the enterprise project. And data virtualization means you don't necessarily have to put all your data in the same place. You can virtualize data that sits somewhere else and bring just components of that in for the analysis. So the point here is that these projects, the enterprise project and the BAR workstream under the enterprise project that Steve and Dave are leading, work hand in hand with this analytics services project that we're just getting started this year. And this slide is meant to be conceptual in that the enterprise project has a start date and an end date, right? That's expressed in green on this slide. So what we're going to build under the scope of the enterprise project. But when the project is done, all the consultants move on to their next thing, and we go into ongoing operations. There are things that will be built for reporting and analytics that make sense to stay with Workday, to stay with the operations, the enterprise operations, as that group and as the scope of the work of that group gets defined. But there are other things that we'll need to carry on as well that don't make sense to be put under the scope of responsibilities of that team. And that's what we're talking about defining through this effort. So, goal number 1. Said simply, we are defining analytics services that will be launched in fiscal 19 and fiscal 20 that are out of scope for the ongoing enterprise operations. And I don't want to come across as nothing's been done here. A significant amount of work has been done here. We've been having multiple conversations about what makes sense to be managed by the enterprise operations team going forward and what's out of scope for that enterprise operations team. We feel like we have sort of the bookends clearly identified. It's that sort of fuzzy middle that we're still trying to sort out. So that will happen within this within this fiscal year. So why do we need a different environment? Why do we need what do I mean by beyond scope? What's an example of that? So you may be aware at the last Board of Trustees meeting, the university strategic plan was officially announced and released. And if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to go take a look at the strategic plan. You can download the PDF, you can download a one-pager. There are multiple pillars of the strategic plan. This happens to be an excerpt from the second pillar called access and affordability. So look at this particular goal. The goal is improve first-year retention and four-year graduation rates. Now, those of you who like data, what kind of data would you need to be able to tell President Drake whether or not we are improving first-year retention and four-year graduation rates? Shout it out. Enrollment, that's good. Historical enrollment over years, right? That tells us, what are our retention and graduation rates today? What have they been over time? And we can compare them, right? So those are metrics. Those are the kinds of things that would be housed in Workday. So think about the improve part. That's a verb. How do we improve? What do we do to improve those things? Well, as a university, we take actions. We put in place programs. So if you think about I'm blanking on the name of the first year, is it the first year experience program? Yeah. First year experience, right? Okay, so if you take first year experience into account, that's a whole program that we invested an awful lot of capital dollars into, because we felt that the data showed that if students live on campus their first year, there is an increased probability that they will stay on. We will increase their retention rate, right? So where do the data sources come from for that? How do we know if we should invest in a program like that? Or how do we know if programs like first year experience are actually working? The evidence of the outcomes might be seen in Workday data, but as we go through the process of establishing those programs, that's where we get into empirical research, and we need different kinds of data from different data sources. All right, so how would we go about finding those data sources today? To quote Julie Carpenter-Hubin, who has affectionately called the university's process for making data discoverable the trick-or-treat approach, the way we work today is you have to know a person, or you have to know an office that happens to have a data set, and you have to, through a personal connection, go ask them for access to the data and wait for an undetermined amount of time for them to go get clearance that they need to give you the data. And then once you have a data set to work with, figure out if that's the right data set to meet your needs. This is not an optimal approach at Ohio State, right? And one of the things that we hope to do, another goal of this project, is to make data much easier to find. So while under the enterprise project, we're going to build the reporting and analytics environment in Amazon Web Services, we're going to have great tools to work with, but that doesn't, and we're going to have Workday data in that environment. It doesn't give us all the data that we need to answer the kinds of questions or deal with the kinds of issues that are put out in the strategic plan. So one way to think about that is maybe a data commons. So the second goal, make it easier to find and use data. Maybe we follow the approach of data commons. So what's a data commons? Has anyone seen or interacted with a data commons? Or do you on a regular basis? This idea of a place to go, a clearinghouse for data. Well, why don't we take a look? Here are some examples to get you thinking about what does a data commons look like. Amazon has a really interesting approach. They have this AWS public datasets program. And if you do a Google search on AWS public datasets, you'll get to this page. What they've done is they've worked with federal government agencies, places like NIH, to take datasets that are publicly available for research, and they've hosted them in the AWS environment. So you, as a subscriber to AWS, you could ask for access to these datasets, and then in your own Amazon account, set up your own compute and analysis, and even there are some folks who have created mobile apps based on the data sets that are here in AWS. You can explore the data however you need, but you don't ever have to download it. It's all right there, accessible through APIs and other methods. Another example is data.gov, and this is an example that comes from the US government. And the point of data.gov is open government, open data, let the citizens see what's going on with the government through data, and create reports and apps that help be good public servants. So you could go to data.gov, the homepage, and see the data sets that they have available in all of these different areas. One of the data sets that I thought was interesting was a spending data set. And another aspect of a data commons is when you get to the homepage about the data, you get some samples so you can tell, is this the right data set that I need or not? That's part of what makes it so difficult, that trick-or-treat approach. You're not really sure what's going to end up in your bag, whether or not you're going to be able to use it. But with the aspects of data commons like data exploration, here's an example. Here's a sample of data from higher ed. And if you scroll up to the top, so you can see, here's a description of the data set. Here's an explorer where you can see, is this the right data set that I need? And if you go all the way up to the top, you can see the data API. Here's how I would call those data into an application that I'm developing and so forth. So that's another aspect of a data commons. Could you go to the last example? So the last example is called Gapminder. This is about the income inequality gap around the world. And it takes data from the 1800s to 2015, and it shows, it shows basically the change in income per person, GDP per capita, in dollars per year, of course, adjusted for inflation. And what's, the colors mean something. So red is Asia, for example. And the big bubble bouncing around, one of those big bubbles is China. And what's really cool about some data commons is not only do you have a way to get data sets and figure out what's in data sets, you have a way to interact with data sets. So with this Gapminder website, you can look at the animation that they have in place that shows changes over time on income per person and so forth. Or on the right-hand side, you can select specific countries, you can select specific indicators like birth rates, or things like that are all part of the data set, but you can see them differently. So this idea of data commons, what would this look like at Ohio State? What would this mean for us? The point is, if we think about President Drake's 2020 vision and the strategic plan that has just been unveiled, and all of the data that are going to be needed to help us make sure that we're on track to meet those goals in the strategic plan, we need a data commons. And we need to prioritize it based on the kinds of data that are going to be needed to do the empirical research on what's working. Are we improving our retention rate? Are we improving our time to degree? As well as the data that will come from our robust reporting environment in Workday. How are we doing today with our graduation rates and time to degree?
All right, so the next goal for analytics services, we want to focus on the user and do things differently than we have in the past. In the past, oftentimes, we've focused on technology, or we've come up with a solution that we've shopped around the university to say, hey, you need this, you need this. But for analytics services, for FY18 and beyond, it's not about a better data warehouse, but about making better decision makers across the university. A diverse group of users with different skill sets, different needs, right? Different knowledge of the data that they might need. So we really want to focus on those users, better analysts, better researchers, better program managers, right? We know that they're throughout the university. So Diane, myself, and a few others, we're going through something right now. It's called Lean Boot Camp. And one of the things that we're learning is some methodologies to really attack it from a perspective of the user, to really understand the user's needs and to meet them and provide the services that meet them at their point of need. So for this process, the first step that we want to do in FY18 is to provide a foundation to understand these problems from the customer's perspective. And this will consist of a series of customer interviews that we'll be conducting throughout folks at the university. We have our first tomorrow. And to really drill down to the problems that they face on a regular basis, to provide open-ended questions where they can not necessarily react to something that we're telling them that we need or that we want them to need, but rather allow them to define and to communicate the problems that they're encountering. From there, once we've been through enough of these interviews over the next few months where we feel that we've found the commonalities of problems across the university, we want to start to define solutions that we feel fill these needs and work again with the users and with the customers to define a mix of services that we can offer that really help them solve these problems and solve the ones that are most important to them. And so then as we move beyond FY18, we'll have those services defined. Through FY19 and 20, we really then want to scale these services. So to really start to build them out through a series of projects and initiatives that can be beneficial to many areas of the university. So this boot camp, the aha moment for me was this concept of falling in love with the problem, not the solution. So just like Kip in Napoleon Dynamite, yes, I do love technology, right? And I know many of us do, right? And so it's so easy, in the data space, there's so much innovation. There's so many things happening so quickly that it's easy to kind of lose track of the business users and the business problems that we're really trying to solve. And so that's where I think this concept of falling in love with the problem, not the solution, is so important to keep in mind, to keep in the forefront all the time. because myself personally, and with Diane and with our teams, we can come up with a lot of great ideas. But if we're not solving the business problems, we've truly failed. So as an example, one need throughout the enterprise project, I think Diane already mentioned this, is an enterprise reporting service. So most likely we're looking at Tableau server, right? And there are needs through the project that it'll help solve. And we know that there are a lot of users around campus already, and so we expect this to be a part of it, one of the services that we'll offer as part of the mix of services. But just using that as an example, right? If you get too fixated on a reporting server by itself, and you look at these 7 steps here of what an analyst, what we're thinking today, we'll refine this as we go through our processes, what an analyst goes through day to day. You could have the perfect reporting solution, but if you can't do numbers 1, 2, and 3, you're really kind of at a loss, right? If you can't get access to the data, what good is a reporting system going to do? So that's just an example of where it's very important for us to understand all aspects of the user, the problems they encounter, and to offer the mix of services that will solve those problems. And again, just to reinforce, right, there are a lot of services that we can offer, but we want to pick that blue pawn there in the picture. We want to pick the one that really meets the user's needs. So, kind of mentioned this, goal 4 for FY19 and 20 will be then building on the analysis that we've done during FY18 and building out these services to scale that that they can be used throughout the university. Going back to the vision of data-driven analytics, data-driven decision-making, right, and access to the data that makes it necessary. The data that we're talking about here, it's owned by the university, right? They are university assets. And one of the things that we really want to do is help users meet those needs and by providing the data assets at the right time and in the right context. In order to make this happen, really, it takes a village, right? This is a big place. It's very decentralized. It's very complex, right? And so all of us, we need to make sure that the investments that we're making are the ideal, that they're the optimal. We have to have the right partnerships. I mean, I could probably spend 40 hours a week just meeting with folks, right? Just talking through the things that we're doing, the things that we're planning to do, right? The strategies, the projects, all those kinds of things, right? Those partnerships are so critical to making this happen. We've got to evolve our skill sets, right? Again, across the university. How do we together bring the university to a place where we have the data and we have the skill sets to do what we need to do with the data, and then socializing the vision, right? Continually socializing the vision over and over and evolving it. And one of the key areas that we can do this in is with the IT strategy. So this is an area that, well, in fact, there was a lunch and learn a week or two ago on the IT strategy specifically, and this is something that Diane has spearheaded throughout the university, working with the IT community across campus. And there's an analytics investment area there, you see. That for FY18, we really want to work with the colleges, with the VP areas, ITPC, and the IT community to really define exactly what that analytics investment area is and what actionable items we put alongside it. So from an IT perspective, what do we need to do? What do we need to have in place? What does the university as a whole need to embrace to ensure that we are making the right decisions and doing the right things to enable the data-driven culture that we want. And so there it is, goal 5, supporting the university IT strategy.
So these are the 5 goals as we launch this initiative. This is a multi-year initiative. This initiative has as its primary focus ensuring the success of the enterprise project and making sure that the data services that are needed for the enterprise project get launched correctly and on time and so forth. But we also recognize that projects that are services that are developed under the enterprise project can and should be leveraged to support a broader data need across the university. So as we define what is in scope for this effort and these ongoing services, we make it easier for folks to find and use those future data in something like a data commons. How do we make this the end of trick-or-treating for data? How do we make sure that what services we put in place are actually meeting end users' needs? Steve talked about the approach that we're going to use over the next year as we define and launch those services. We need to get them rolled out. And we need to do this as a village, because the OCIO is not going to be the data custodian or the data steward for all the data sets that are needed around the university. We're just here to be a partner to facilitate data use across the university. So it takes a village. It makes sense to integrate this with the overall university IT strategy and keep things moving forward in support of the president's strategic plan. So let's stop there and open it up for questions, comments, discussion. What do you think? No one's throwing anything. That's good.
Sounds like a good idea.
The question is our role going to be to make more data sets available and or to provide visualizations around those data? Is that essentially what you're asking? I think the goal, the ideal is both, but one comes before the other. And so I would say a first priority is to identify what are the data sets that we need to have accessible to people in support of the president's strategic goals. How do we identify those data sets, and what would it mean to pull those together into something like a data commons and just make them findable? So if you think about what you're doing with Unison and getting learning management system data available and getting things like TrackDat data for assessments and data from EAB on-course, for advising, how do we start, which ones of those or which aspects of those data sets do we really need to pull together to make available for empirical research and other analyses to help us know if we're on track for student success? So I think the first goal is figure out what do we need to pull together. As we work with communities about visualizing the data and making dashboards and scorecards and things like that available, I see that as sort of a continuum of effort, with some effort starting not within the analytics services team, but that's the training and development piece. You should have folks on your team who can develop dashboards and scorecards. But at the point where you say, you know what, this is useful to the entire university and it needs to go through a quality engineering effort, if you will, or a release engineering kind of effort, then I think that's where this group would get involved and also could help with consulting along the way. That's my take on it. What's your take?
I was going to say, both. I think, the analogy of the big boulders, I think that's one thing that we've got to do over the next year through talking with customers. I think we have a pretty good idea, but we know that the ERP data is big. We know learning management data is big. Where does career services fit? Where does student life fit? Maybe advancement. So I think identifying some of those large data sets, and each is to some degree going to have its own strategy with its own data steward and so on and so forth. And then I think also, back to the visualization aspect, I think bringing more commonality and more shared, from intellectual property to the tools and so on and so forth. Hopefully we can get to a point where, hey, there's some advancement dashboard that maybe is great for enrollment, that at least we can share, repurpose that more than we do today, which is to say usually it's done in completely different areas without any insight. So I think those are two paths that we'll just have to continually go on and improve and pick off, the most strategic and the most realistic and just continue to move forward.
Other questions?
There were a couple slides I mentioned, like training and support for the user community. That feels more like, how to use Tableau or how to find data kind of thing. Is there any thought towards actually giving like analysis training? Here's how to do your job better versus
Definitely.
Yeah, Scott, I think you're right. In the past, it has been more tools focused, and again, it goes back to oftentimes like, hey, you're going to use this tool, learn it, or else you're screwed, But I do think you're right. There's some of that still needs to happen. Don't get me wrong, but I do think we can get deeper deeper into their worlds and find some of these things, where the methodology and an understanding of the methodology maybe is more important than the tool. And then hopefully we can, again, leveraging a lot of the work we're doing, start to kind of cross-pollinate those areas as well. So a lot of work to do there, but I think we definitely have to think about training differently.
There was another question over here.
Who's going to take responsibility for maintaining metadata? Are you going to have a library and descriptions of all this data and how it's collected and how valid it is and what it's
I'll repeat the question. Are we going to have metadata, and are we going to make sure that the metadata are clean and up to date? I don't see how you can have a data commons without it. And under the enterprise project, we are fortunate to have Laura Gast with us, who is our first data governance person in a data governance role. Say hi, Laura. Who, through the enterprise project, is going to help us define what that means. So what does it mean to have metadata? And under the enterprise project, we are creating an example and a foundation that we would hope to leverage and repurpose to other data sets that would come into that data commons environment. The data are useless. You're back to trick or treat if you can't find it.
Yeah, I don't think the trick or treat bag, I don't think you get a metadata document that comes along with the candy, right? I mean, it's a problem. It's a problem all the way up to reporting different numbers to the board. So yes, and I want to speak for Laura, but one of the things that she's working on is along with enterprise security, with Roland Kreml and others, is what is the role of the data steward going forward, and it might include, hey, you're managing metadata, right? Big data set, small data set. Here are the standards that we need. So,
Laura, anything you want to add? Laura says we're working with offices like Institutional Research and Planning to make sure we take a more global view.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, the having metadata is obviously important first step, but then I think the discoverability of the metadata is important too. And I think this is going to change culture. Like, I don't want people to know that this data exists. Well, if the data is owned by the university and it has value by someone else, perhaps they should be able to discover it.
It's a university asset.
Yes.
Other questions?
So most of what I was kind of hearing sounded like business application. I wondered if there's any thought about research institution as well.
There is. So the question is, this sounds like all business application. Have we been thinking about research applications? So there are two aspects of research applications here. One is there are many researchers that are, let's call them experiment rich but data poor. Researchers, particularly in computer science and engineering, who have in their research methods, it doesn't really matter what data set they're using, they just need data sets to work with. So for some researchers, having access to a data commons or a group of data sets that are well defined, back to the point about metadata, that they can access for their research project, that's hugely beneficial to them. Other researchers in fields like education, many of the data sets that we'll collect are in line with the kind of work that they do. So they would find this even more beneficial because the data are directly in line with their areas of research. For still other researchers, the tools, the environment, the Ray environment, and having a team of people that from a sort of production level service offering approach can talk to them and their graduate students about how to perform analytics at scale, and conversely, knowing that we have a research community who can teach us how to perform research at scale. I think there are many new collaborations that could come out of this. So if we can get the data commons right, perhaps that's an environment that can host data commons for research data sets that are beyond business applications. hopefully we can have researchers informing what we do along the way so that the environment that we build is as useful for empirical research as it is for analytics and decision making. Jason.
It was kind of along Shirley's question there. You know, it sounds very business-oriented researchers. Would students have access to this data? Would we ever,
So,
ask them, put it in
so
data analytics class? They would have.
So the question is, would we give access to students to these data sets? And when we were looking at data commons examples, one of the things that we talked about was those were all publicly available data sets that anybody could use. And often those publicly available data sets are used for teaching. In fact, if you had a Gapminder, there's like a whole group of lesson plans and class activities that you can do around the data. It's really interesting. Would we give access to students for these data? Maybe. It depends on the data set. It depends on the use. It depends on if the student's operating on his own or in conjunction with a faculty member on a research project. I think what we would commit to is that all of the data sources, ideally, would be knowable. Like, what data do we have? But access to the data, it would depend on the data.
Yeah, I agree. We've had some early discussions, like with more faculty, to use it in the classroom setting. And de-identification in the past because we don't have a good de-identification capability, that's kind of held it back. But I think we go through the channels. We would go through the channels with the data steward and so forth. But I'd be very open to that. Why use, if some data analytics class is using data sets and going to make some recommendations, why not have it be OSU's data, right? So I think there's some things to work through. But again, I think all of this, a lot of the things we talked about today enable that.
I think of the hackathon and students building mobile apps as part of the hackathon. If they had access to a lot of this data, I'm sure we'd all be blown away by the kinds of things that they would come up with.
In the other direction, does the scope or vision include providing access to maybe some non-OSU publicly available data sets that as individuals can use for context?
Yeah, so how would we include, let's say, external data sets or benchmark data or data to be able to benchmark or compare within the scope of what we're talking about? I think we should be open to such things. We already do data mashups with external benchmark data all the time. And this is something that IRP deals with on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So that use case, that function exists. Can we reposition those data sets in a data commons so it's easier for people to get to them? That might be a possibility. Or would consortiums like Unison, of which we're a member, where we might want to be able to benchmark learning management data with other Unison member schools, that might happen in the Unison platform. But I think we'd want to be open to that capability, however it's needed.
So you guys said there would be an API for each data set, right?
That's the vision.
That's the goal, right? So is there currently a group that you're looking at to help provide that, or around the university? Is that us? Is that
I think that's part of the discussion with the IT community. I think we have obviously some ideas. Also we've been talking with the web services folks, with enterprise integration and so forth. And so I think together from OCIO perspective, right, we have to provide the methodologies and consistency across those methodologies from a data perspective, based on what the need in the community is. And this goes into training too, right? So some folks might say, just give me a flat file in my SFTP server. Well, we might say, hey, I think there's a better way that you can do that. These other two departments are trying to do the same thing. They're going to take you through some web service training, perhaps, or some integration training to try to move them along the maturity curve. But I think that we've suffered from that not being, in the past, not being able to meet the users in the ways that they need. So what they do, they just copy it all down and they just keep their own local sets. So I think that's something that the specifics of the methodologies and the technologies and the protocols are to be defined, but I think we have to be diverse and consistent in how we offer those.
We have a lot of experience being a bottleneck. And if we were to take the approach that only employees of OCIO can write APIs for these data sets, then that exacerbates us being a bottleneck problem. I don't want to recreate that problem as we go forward. I want to eliminate it. But we have to do it with people who are educated on how to write APIs and with a quality control mechanism to make sure the APIs work correctly, are secure, and all of that. So I would hope that we could get, takes a village, call it the API barn raising, if you will. We could get a lot of help.
All right. Thank you, everybody.